And it is time to get started. I'm going to hand over to our meeting chair, who will be known, I think, to most of you. Welcome, Caroline Lucas. Over to you to chair this morning's biggest ever CMP webinar.
Thank you so much, Rupert. And let me just add my thanks and welcome to everybody on the call this morning. It is very lovely to see all your faces on this early Tuesday morning. Thank you so much for being with us. So as Rupert said, this is our biggest ever webinar, and it's really about diving deeply into the issue of climate adaptation. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the Glacier Trust and the Climate Majority Project. As Rupert has said, I offer some advice to the Climate Majority Project. I'm Caroline Lucas, former Green Party MP, and delighted to be chair of this, where we're going to talk about the new report co-written by the Glacier Trust and the CMP called We Need to Talk About Adaptation. I will introduce you to the speakers very shortly, but just a bit of housekeeping first. As you've heard, the chat is being busily used already, and we're going to use that for questions as well. So if you do have any questions, put them in the chat, and my colleague Anya will be monitoring it, and I'll be trying to keep an eye on it as well. And there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And in fact, the webinar is in two halves. So first, there'll be an introduction to this report. We need to talk about adaptation. We'll then hear a response from Sarah Meir, the lead project coordinator at Retrofit Balsall Heath. And then there's time for questions. And then there's a second half, and that's when we'll hear the update from the SAFER campaign, basically the launch of the SAFER campaign from the Climate Majority Project, showing how it's seeking to increase the profile, the quantity and the quality of adaptation work in the country, and to amplify the many projects that are already underway, and to invite everyone into that space. And again, there'll be time for questions there. And I guess by way of introduction, I would simply say that I am so delighted that this morning's meeting and the excellent report we're about to hear about are part of a real upsurge, I feel, in a focus on climate adaptation. I think for too long, adaptation has been, like the poor cousin of mitigation. It's been sidelined, often misunderstood as a concept, and deprioritized as a policy. And I think some, even in the climate movement, sometimes fear that it's a distraction from climate mitigation. And I think the case that we're going to be making this morning is that the opposite is the truth, that far from being a distraction from the urgent work of climate mitigation, adaptation can be a route to engage far more people with that imperative, as well as being an urgently needed approach in its own right. That adaptation is a way of making the climate challenge real in people's own lives, that far from being the kind of technical abstraction of net zero, which can quite often feel quite meaningless to many people, it's about building practical community resilience, offering people agency, and I would argue authentic hope as well. We know that not enough of that is happening. The government's own advisors, the Climate Change Committee, has repeatedly warned that government progress on adaptation is either too slow, it's stalled, it's heading in the wrong direction. And therefore, it has fallen to the UK's main environmental organisations and leaders to champion the cause of climate adaptation and to pioneer new approaches. And that's exactly what we're going to hear about this morning. And so our speakers are going to be Kate Power, who is the report co-author. She is a renowned expert in sustainable consumption and behaviour change. Mark Holmes, the executive director from the Glacier Trust, after 10 years with the Environment Agency. Our own Rupert Reed, from whom you've already been hearing, co-founder, co-director of the Climate Majority Project. Ed Jarvis, from whom you've also heard, director from of campaigns with the Climate Majority Project. And then Sarah, who I mentioned, Sarah Meir, the project coordinator with Retrofit Balsall Heath. So for the first half of this webinar, which will focus on the report, let me hand the floor to Kate Power, the report's co-author, who I think will take us through some slides as well.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And welcome to this launch of We Need to Talk About Adaptation, the 2025 edition, which, as you heard, is a collaboration between the Glacier Trust and the Climate Majority Project. We're so happy that so many of you are here, because it shows that so many of you have an interest in this topic that we find so important. And hopefully by the end of this session, we'll all be talking even more enthusiastically about adaptation. Oh, that is the right slide. Okay, great. So you might yourselves have noticed that the conversation around climate change is starting to shift, and that mitigation is just important as ever. But as a society, we're starting to acknowledge that climate impacts are now defining daily life. And you might have experienced those climate impacts yourself. Actually invite you to drop a word or two in the chat if you have experienced climate impacts where you live. Where I live, in the valley of the River Elbe in Germany, all the talk is about flooding. That's a big problem for us here. We've also experienced forest fires. And if you've ever woken up with a house full of smoke from a forest fire, you'll know it's a very scary experience. So we do need to talk about this, and that's why we're here. So let's have a look at the next slide, please. So our report, as you heard, we need to talk about adaptation 2025. It's a temperature check on how the UK's leading environmental voices are responding to the reality of those climate impacts. Our task today is not to summarise that report, but really we want to activate it to explore what this analysis means for us, the climate majority who care about climate change, and how we can move from awareness of the impacts to agency and action. So today we're going to have a look at what's changed since 2020, why adaptation language matters, and how we can make it resonate beyond the policy world. So now I'm going to hand over for the next section to Mark Holmes from the Glacier Trust to explain how all this work got started.
Thanks, Kate. If we just move on to the next slide, that would be great. So I think there's a question really of why we chose the 5 organisations that we did. We had a look at of nearly 9,000 articles over the last 5 years from within this sector to try and gauge what the movement, what the momentum was like. So over 70 organisations which we identified were talking about this, albeit a little bit less than we would like. And we decided that we would deep dive into the 5 organisations that are on the screen there. As kind of leaders really in the UK NGO, environmental NGO sphere. And that follows on from 2020 when the last report was published, which I'll touch on in a second. The way that we did this, it was a little easier than it was 5 years ago with the development of AI. So we could dive a little deeper and explore further, which presented challenges, but also meant that data was certainly had a lot more depth to it than previously. And we looked at things like campaigns, any media, publications, reports, anything really that had come out from these 5 organisations. We searched for various terms that were adaptation related, not limited to adaptation, but terms like climate resilience, and also not excluding mitigation either as a talking point. So what were we trying to do, and hopefully what the report looks into is kind of put these 5 organisations under the spotlight a little bit, along with the idea of adaptation as a concept that we here at the Glacier Trust have been pushing for coming up to 17 years now, and see how that is framed and how that is how that's changed really from 2020, and how it could be a bit of a challenge for those to continue using the terms and the terminology to get this discussion moving forward over the next 5 years or so. Next slide, please. So back in 2020, the Glacier Trust published what was the second We Need to Talk About Adaptation report. And that acts very much as a baseline for this study that we have here, that we are very, very happy to partner with Climate Majority Project in publishing this report this morning. So back in 2020, it was less than 1%, about 0.8% of all communications coming out of these NGOs mentioned adaptation, which was 7 out of 850. We took that as kind of a near silence, really. It's not a core, or wasn't a core pillar of climate response. It was something that we felt was really not on the agenda of these organisations or the wider media in the UK. And we think that sort of shaped public perception, really. If it's not discussed, it isn't prioritised, people don't talk about it. The more you talk about things, the more they get talked about. And that's the same in general public, in the political sphere, and certainly financially when we're talking about supporting organisations, countries, certainly in the global south where we operate in Nepal, to support those people to adapt on a larger scale than they already are. But we're really delighted to release this report this morning. Mentions have risen sharply, which is positive. There's still a lag, as I'm sure you will see in the report as you read it, and that coverage remains kind of active, reactive, and fragmented, so that there's no proactivity there. It tends to be reaction to things that are already going on. And you, as you dive into the report, you will see that there are pinch points. There are sort of key moments, such as Friends of the Earth legal challenge to the National Adaptation Plan, which almost by default in the title will increase traffic. But it's a positive step. It's moving in the right direction. Our challenge now is to kind of push that on further and encourage more conversation. So I will hand it back into the present day. I will hand over. I think this is Sam, is it?
Thanks, Mark. Can we move slide, please? Just to the next one. So thanks, Mark. So 5 years on from the first study, adaptation has become more noticeable part of 𝐸NGO and Green Party comms. And that's certainly starting to show in broader media landscape too as well. But let's stick with the 𝐸NGOs and Green Party for now. Coverage of those specific communications, outreach, if you like, on adaptation has increased roughly tenfold. And we saw around 1,000 articles combined since the first study, which on paper looks like, definitely real progress. And we can see some of the coverage there on the right-hand side. But I think, as Mark's already touched on, much of that visibility has come from one dominant story, and that's the Friends of the Earth legal challenge to UK government's NAP3 or National Adaptation Plan legal case back in 2024. For those who, just to remind everyone, the High Court case argued that weak adaptation breached citizens' rights to life and a home, of course, and it reframed adaptation really as a rights and justice issue rather than perhaps a technical one. And it certainly captured the media's attention precisely, as we've seen, precisely because it's adversarial and a clear story of confrontation. So your typical good versus evil, et cetera, et cetera. So while adaptation is now appearing more often, much of it's still arriving through, if you like, conflict and crisis, not through long-term strategy or leadership. It's certainly visible, but it's fragmented, and you could argue more noise than narrative. So if we just move on, please, Ed. Okay, so just going back to it, we can see on here on the left-hand side, how much the legal case is equated to. 81% of the articles that we analysed from the 𝐸NGOs and the Green Party in this period of 18 months was attributed to the Friends of the Earth legal case. So what's also striking, no doubt about it, in this phase of the research is how different organisations have started to weave adaptation into their existing agendas as well, each through, if you like, the lens of what they already know how to talk about, and it shows real breadth, but also fragmentation as well. And I think, we'll come on to the summary of our thinking from that. But just very quickly to go through each of the organisations individually. Friends of the Earth, we've obviously mentioned that, but after the ruling, they used a variety of comms platforms, podcasts, newsletters, local networks, etc., to promote, I guess, a right to a safe home and a right of a safe future, if you like. Certainly compelling, but perhaps polarizing a little bit because it frames adaptation as oversight and even failure, not foresight necessarily. WWF UK took a more constructive tone, perhaps. Their Living the Planet report 2024 made climate resilience, a climate resilient nature, a headline metric, if you like, and called for what many of you will remember is a Living Planet Act to embed resilience into law. And they use farming and food as the bridge. So soil health, water security, dietary transition, etc., positioning adaptation as investment and not retreat, if you like. And of course, what is important to say here is there's no direct criticism here. It's good kind of, it's good comms in many ways. But again, we'll come on to a minute about our summary of how it all translates. RSPP frames adaptation more through pragmatism, if you like, than anything else. They focus on climate smart farming, wetland restoration, and coastal realignment projects, such as the Wallasey Island in Essex. And as I say, their tone is pragmatic and policy literate. Adaptation is as, if you like, ecosystem management and community protection. So all good there. But it equates the RSPP comms in the period equates to just less than 5% of the conversation. Greenpeace takes another justice narrative, similar to Friends of the Earth. Those who created the crisis should pay. Their Polluters Pay campaign pushes for a levy on fossil fuel profits to fund, resilience and recovery, no doubt about it. And I would say that coverage peaks around protests, around COP moments, and investigations into flood defence inequality or heat risk in housing. But they use adaptation rhetorically as proof of political failure, which keeps it, no doubt visible, but rarely perhaps solution focused. It's more on that political failure thing. Finally, Green Party gives adaptation a civic face, no doubt about it. Its messaging links resilience to local governance, to public health and housing equality. Phrases like climate safe homes, heat resilient neighbourhoods, fair adaptation funding, etc. It's adaptation as no doubt social infrastructure, basic social housing and social infrastructure. But the party needs to raise its game, given that 3% of the adaptation comms in this period is just 3% is attributed to the Greens. So we can see together that there's 5 distinct pathways into the conversation. For Friends of the Earth as legal justice, for WWF as nature and food systems, for RSPP it's habitats and land use, for Greenpeace it's accountability and equality, and for the Green Party it's local fairness and resilience as well. As I said, collectively, they've made adaptation certainly present in UK climate discourse and climate media, but we'd say that it's not yet fully combined or fully coherent. Each narrative, no doubt, stands on its own, and together they compete for airtime. And they're still lacking a single shared storyline or an adaptation backbone, if you like, of national preparedness, which I think is the vital part. Just going on to the last slide in what we want to share from the report. And this is where it gets, just sort of added further interest, I think, in terms of how the coverage plays out in actual fact. When we look at the line chart here tracking total coverage volume across the 5 NGOs and the Green Party, we can see how the rhythm of attention really shifts over time. So through 2023 and early 24, at the start of the chart, we can see that adaptation holds a pretty low but steady presence, but even so, low presence, I mean, it's less than sort of 20 pieces of coverage, if you like, ongoing. Background conversation, really, I think, to be fair to say, rather than a headline issue. But what then gets very interesting is from mid-2024, coverage starts to climb. And I think what's looking back, that rise does coincide with the Climate Change Committee's warning that the UK was dangerously unprepared for rising heat and flood risk, and with a growing sense after 2 extreme summers that mitigation alone will not be enough. So we can see almost from the coverage, the kind of how it played out, within the media and obviously in real life as well. That moment created space for adaptation to move higher up the agenda, no doubt. And the Friends of the Earth legal challenge to NAP3 became the focal point for that shift as well. But the pattern is still uneven, as we've said. The volume rises, no doubt about it. The rhythm remains episodic, bursts of activity, so spikes of activity, as we can see there from June 24 onwards, followed by, much coming out of that, much lower volume or even silence. So there's no sustained pressure, no continuous public narrative necessarily about preparedness from these parties. And when you zoom out across the wider media landscape, that pattern becomes even clearer. Lots of smaller conversations around adaptation happening across government agencies, local councils, businesses, academics, insurers, etc. Everyone using terms like resilience, preparedness, climate proofing, adaptation finance, etc. But again, I'd say these are sporadic and disjointed. Everyone seems to be pushing a set of buzzwords, if you like, without much coordination or continuity. And I think that's what really matters here, and one of the kind of the major points of our report, that, you know, because essentially what the public doesn't hear, 20 nuanced conversations, it hears much less than that. And without a shared story, these separate threads don't have anything that feels like, you know, sustained momentum. So if the Climate Change Committee is now warning that UK infrastructure is dangerously exposed, we must prepare for 2 degrees of warming before 2050, you know, then it's the NGOs who are best placed to turn that warning into pressure, no doubt about it. You know, they're already having the credibility, they've got the media reach, the storytelling experience to sustain the conversation. But what we feel is missing is the unified push, you know, using adaptation as a rallying point, if you like. Not just a reaction at the point the media follows events. So it's really that sense, if NGOs can lead with coherence and urgency and drive that pressure, the media will follow them, not the next disaster. Okay, passing over to Rupert.
Sam, thank you. Hello again, everybody. I'm going to build on what Sam has said by taking us with the next slide into the part of the report where we are giving our conclusions and recommendations. So, yeah, why does this matter? Well, decarbonisation is global. Adaptation is local and immediate. Part of what we're saying here is that what this report offers and outlines is a way into thinking climate that is less polarizing, more relatable, and inherently community-oriented. Talking about adaptation can move people from anxiety to action. That is, to how do we live well with difficult change? It reframes climate work around concrete protection, fairness, and community, rather than guilt and abstraction. For the climate majority, and when I say the climate majority here, I don't just mean the climate majority projects, right? I mean something far wider. I mean the actual climate majority of people who are already getting it and concerned and want to get involved. For the climate majority, this is the leverage point. Adaptation, done right, is the leverage point, turning realism into engagement. And what Sam was saying there was that reactive coverage alone can't be enough to build resilience. Adaptation is where agency lives, and that agency needs to be grown in a more organic and consistent way. When adaptation appears only in moments of crisis, it risks reinforcing fear rather than readiness. To make resilience mainstream, we need ongoing constructive communication, showing that preparing for change is part of living well, not a sign of failure. Next slide, please. So, how we talk about adaptation shapes what comes next. The adaptation discussion, and this is part of what we're looking at in our report, whether this is happening or not. To some extent it is, but not enough. The adaptation discussion needs to be strategic, transformative, ecosystems-based, fair, not just superficial, reactive, and defensive. That is absolutely crucial. It's not enough to talk about adaptation. How you talk about it is also crucial. So how do we change that conversation? Next slide, please. So here's some headings, and these amount to our central recommendations. Be strategically honest. The post 1.5 degree centigrade world, tragically, is already here. We had a very striking confirmation of that this morning. Antonio Guterres has just come out and finally said, we've lost 1.5. We are not going to stay below the 1.5 degree planetary boundary. This is what enables the adaptation conversation, and this is what makes it so crucial, because we are in the age of consequences. We need to make adaptation tangible, which means many things, including, for example, greening cities, one of the most striking and crucial ways of improving people's lives and making adaptation visible. Shifting the frame means replacing net zero talk with the language of resilience, preparedness, and becoming safer. That, of course, does not mean that we are no longer interested in decarbonisation. On the contrary, it's about powering the decarbonisation story by powering the adaptation and resilience story, because those wake people up and are much more concrete. They're a way in. We need to keep fair and essential. Who is most exposed? Who decides? Who benefits? People won't welcome adaptation action unless they sense that it is fair and just. And it inherently is and can be, because adaptation and vulnerability and impacts, these are the ways that climate is most relevant to most people, in particular working class people. And finally, using stories, not slogans, this builds on the making adaptation tangible idea. Remember that people remember lived resilience more than policy ambition. It's inherently more relatable. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to bring adaptation into every climate dialogue. That means policy, business, finance, health, education, activism. It needs to be everywhere. At the moment, it's too patchy. We need to champion local resilience initiatives, which means things like climate hubs, retrofit schemes, community energy, citizen monitoring. We have many people involved in these things on this call. You can see some of them in the Zoom chat. Accountability is important. We need to fund a serious national resilience plan. That, as you'll be hearing later in this call, is a central demand of the Safer campaign. Polluters are going to have to pay to make that possible. And we need to encourage funders and media to measure credibility. And what I mean by that, this is really, really important. It isn't enough to just measure emissions targets. We need to measure resilience outcomes. And that is something which is only just frankly getting underway. It's inherently harder because adaptation is more retail, is more local. But we're going to have to find ways of doing this. Next slide, please. This slide really, this final slide of my bit really speaks for itself. I won't read it out. You can read it. The headline is crucial, though. People sometimes still say, isn't adaptation kind of giving up? And we say, no, adaptation is not giving up. It's showing up. It's showing up to actually get involved and start mucking in together to do what needs to be done. And with that, I'll hand over for our final few slides of the presentation back to Kate Power.
Thanks, Rupert. Next slide, please, which is showing a diagram. It's actually not from our report, but we liked it. It's from the website of an organisation called Highland Adapts, a collaboration of Scottish organisations promoting adaptation work. And it shows that when we focus on adaptation, there's still a huge overlap with mitigation. So we really don't need to choose one or the other. We can focus on both as being equally important and overlapping. But as Caroline Lucas reminds us, we really do need to make sure adaptation becomes part of the core narrative, and that it's rooted in justice, that it's shaped by communities, and that it's carried by all of our organisations. While here, I'd just like to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to Caroline Lucas for writing the foreword to the report, which I'm sure you're going to find very inspiring reading. Next slide, please. So really the final message of this report is let's work together. Let's talk about adaptation, but a transformative adaptation that includes everyone, and let's raise the volume. And I'm going to finish off on the next slide with a quote from Asad Rehman, who recently became the CEO of Friends of the Earth. We've been really impressed with the adaptation work that all the organisations have done, especially Friends of the Earth. And so Rupert interviewed him recently, and this is what he said, that the impacts are inevitable, that adaptation is inevitable. Our task is to build stronger, fairer communities that can withstand misinformation as well as storms and fight for the right to live with dignity and balance. So with this stark reminder of why we need to talk about adaptation, I'd like to thank you very much for your enthusiastic engagement in the chat, and I hope you enjoy reading the report, and I'll hand back to Caroline.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, everybody. That was a really fantastic introduction to the report, and has triggered A huge amount of comment in the chat. It's a lot of people saying it's quite hard to keep up with it, but rest assured, two things. First of all, it's going to be saved, that chat, and sent to everybody who's on this call, so you don't have to worry about it. And if you want to get it even sooner than that, then if you just click on those three dots at the top right of the chat, you can save it yourself that way, because there really is an incredibly rich and flourishing discussion going on in the chat. I've been trying to keep up to date with some of the questions, and forgive me if I've missed some, but I was just going to try and group them a little bit. So, for example, there seemed to be a little kind of cluster of questions around 𝐴𝐸𝐸, in other words, the Atlantic Meridional overturning. Circulation, in other words, as Chris says, how much consideration is being given to 𝐴𝐸𝐸 decline in the general adaptation discourse? Tony says, what is the current thinking around the balance between adaptation to warming versus adaptation to the cooling, which 𝐴𝐸𝐸 would bring around? I'd love to put that question to someone. Kate, I'm not sure if it's best to you or if you want to redirect it somewhere.
No, that's not my area, sorry.
I can have a first go at that.
Thanks.
Because it's a great question. We addressed it in our prequel report, the SAFER report, the Strategic Adaptation report. We have to be ready for a profoundly uncertain future, right? The future we are facing is not reliably a future of overheating. It is a future of growing climate chaos, of possible further heating, and of possible dramatic cooling in some parts of the world. What does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. In the SAFER report, we discussed the fact that we have discovered with some of our researchers that the national grid is not preparing for possible 𝐴𝐸𝐸 collapse. They're preparing for a hotter world. They're not preparing for a possible colder world in this part of the world. And that is catastrophic at a time when Britain is investing so much of its effort into electrification, into decarbonisation. So what's the implication? The implication is that adaptation, as implied by the questions, has to be something which tries to protect us against the great uncertainty that is coming. What does that look like? Well, I'm just going to give you one slightly different example, which I think is quite stimulating of one's thoughts in this regard. It isn't enough, if you're thinking of what trees to plant for a future quasi-Mediterranean climate here in Britain. You need to be planting Mediterranean-style trees, you need to be planting native trees, and you need to be planting Scandinavian-type trees. Because if 𝐴𝐸𝐸 collapses, those are the kind of trees we're going to need. And if you do that, if you actually plant flexibly, say in a community orchard, all those kinds of trees, you're doing so knowing that some of them are going to die, which is very sad. But it's much better than the possibility that all of them will die. That's the kind of thinking that we need. And that's why it matters so much how in this new report we need to talk about adaptation. We're emphasizing how you talk about adaptation really matters.
Can I just come in on that as well, Rupert? I think to kind of answer the 𝐴𝐸𝐸 question. So the Glacier Trust, we're very small. We're a small charity. We work in local place-based adaptation in Nepal, and I think adaptation needs to be okay. We have global issues, but we have really local solutions. So I think that. Certainly the experience we have in Nepal is that one valley is the adaptation required is very different to another valley, and I think that's the same across the globe. I think adaptation practices on the ground in Cornwall will be very different to those up in Aberdeenshire, for example. So I think that there are local solutions to what is a growing global issue, or regional issue, I guess, when we start looking at 𝐴𝐸𝐸 and various heating and cooling cycles. So I think we need to view adaptation as a sort of global concept, but with local and regional implication models. So I think that's kind of what I think we need to look at from a kind of adaptation implementation position.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Mark. Okay, and now there were a kind of cluster of questions around language and communication, particularly in the context of the rise of the hard right. So Jackie Carpenter was the first person I noticed talking about how sometimes the language that we use isn't very compelling in the sense that we talk in very academic terms about triggering, framing, driving. How do we get away from that? Stephen says, because of the rise of the right, how do we address their lack of urgency on everything related to climate change? And again, he says the use of language is critical. Emily asks whether or not we've reached out to climate outreach, because they do a lot of work thinking about language. And John Gray says, what words work best in crossing the kind of political economic divides, not just talking to people who are concerned about environment. So who could I put a cluster of questions about language to? Can that come to Kate?
I'm actually going to bounce that to Sam. Okay. Is that the right person?
I thought I was going to say that. I think this is really interesting, actually. I think that from my part, I mean, there's not a huge amount I want to say here, because I think we could sort of have another webinar on language, no doubt about it. I think part of the issue from my perspective, going back many years from comms, is that we tend to get over specific on the science, because that's where it starts from, and what that fails to do is translate into people's everyday lives. I think 𝐓𝐿𝐴𝐶𝑖𝑛𝐥𝐵, the management consultancy, has a fantastic phrase, which is when they talk about sustainability, which is a sort of not the greatest of words, but given it's sort of, what does it mean? But the point being is that they say we need to make sustainability. We need to stop asking about how we can make humans more sustainable, and we need to work out how we can make sustainability more human. And I think that we can kind of phrase that equally around climate comms, adaptation, etc., etc. How do we get into people's lives and change the narrative so that that we're actually talking in people's everyday lexicon, everyday language? How do we get into people's minds and hearts, if you like? How do we play that card so that people really fully understand? I don't think anyone really understands the true nature of what net zero is. I don't think really people understand what 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels mean. Really, I think The Guardian ran something about this a few years ago around what actually people, everyday people understand about, terms like net zero. Nobody really had a clue, to be quite frank. And it frustrates me massively when I hear about government ministers, particularly Ed Miliband and others, talking about, this charge for net zero, and it's A, so weaponized, and B, fundamentally it doesn't mean anything to anyone. But if you are talk to people about, having safer homes, etc., etc., better living, better standards, etc., etc., more equitable life, I think people would start to take more heed, if you like. So yeah, it's a big topic. Language is a massive topic. I think we need to shift it massively, shift the narrative, and I think we'll get more people engaged.
Lovely, thank you. And then there are a couple of questions about the kind of balance between national and local when it comes to action. So Peter Garbutt, to what extent do we need government action when adaptation is essentially community-led? And then Kevin saying, if adaptation is more local, then how do we influence government to ensure more decentralization of funding and political capital and so forth? I've done a stunningly bad job so far of guessing who's going to answer which question, so I don't quite know where to put that one. If anyone could volunteer, I'd be very grateful. So it's a question about the balance between national and local.
Well, I'm happy to make a start, and can I suggest that Morgan may want to jump in? This is Morgan Phillips, the one report author we haven't heard from so far on this question, because it's very relevant to his expertise. The start I'll make is simply to say that Peter is, of course, right. Adaptation, as we've said, is fundamentally more local and accessible a matter than decarbonisation. But as we'll hear in the second half of this call, it's also essential for government to take a lead, and that's part of the essential objectives of the Safer campaign. We can't expect local communities to do all the stepping up, especially as, of course, some such communities, which are especially vulnerable, including abroad, are really going to need help. But yeah, Morgan Phillips, would you like to add to that?
Thanks, Rupert. Hi, everyone. Sorry not to be on the panel from the beginning. I think the really fascinating thing about adaptation is that it is so unique to where people's are and their circumstances, as Mark pointed out with Nepal. And valley by valley, the adaptation needs change, and that's true in the UK as well. I think a point which I'd want to kind of bring up around, and it relates to language as well, is storytelling is so important here. At a local level, people need examples of what adaptation looks like and what good adaptation looks like, because there can be many examples of adaptation where people aren't thinking about the downstream effects of the adaptation strategy they're implementing. So again, in the Nepal example, it may be that one village is running out of water, and so it diverts a stream so that it can have water for its land, but that in itself is diverting water away from people further downstream who need it. So it's thinking really consciously about the adaptations people are taking, and thinking about the downstream effects, both kind of literally and metaphorically, of their adaptations. So a key reason we need to talk about adaptation is that it can be done badly, and if we aren't actually looking at the adaptations people are taking and holding them account on them and helping them to think about different forms of adaptation, then there's a danger that people either on purpose in a kind of selfish way will adapt in ways which suit them but maybe harm others, and also they may adapt in ways where they haven't actually thought about an adaptation strategy that can either intersect with justice needs or mitigation needs as well. So it's really having the conversations and giving great examples of both of the good as well as the kind of the bad versions of adaptation that we're seeing are really important to help people to figure out which adaptation strategy they should adopt in their area. And I want to say a big thanks to everyone involved in this report. And when we started this back in 2019, 2020, when we did two quite simple reports, which you can find on the Glacier Trust website, I never thought it would result in this amazing comprehensive report. And it's been an absolute delight to read it and to see all the inputs and the stories within it. So I really encourage everyone to have a read of it. And so thank you to everyone who's been involved with it, and pass back to Caroline.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Morgan. I know there are more questions that we haven't got to yet, but I want to lead us into our second half of this webinar so that people can hear directly from the Climate Majority Project about the campaign and how they are developing safer. There were a couple of things I just wanted to say. Someone called Sam was talking about refreshing the MSc in Sustainability and Adaptation at the Centre for Alternative Technology, which sounds really interesting. He's asking what skills and knowledge are needed for the future. So if anyone can find that question in the chat, you might want to put some answers, your thoughts about what are the skills and the knowledge that people are going to need for this future that we're talking about in the chat. The very first question actually came from Chris Keane a long time ago, back at 8:36. He was asking about the role of ecosystem restoration as a means for both mitigation and adaptation. And I suspect we might well come to that in the questions for the second half. But if we could draw a close to that first half, thank again the Glacier Trust for all their amazing work on that report. And now I'm going to hand over to Rupert to introduce the update on the Safer campaign.
Yes, but before we get there,
I'm not. I knew I was going to forget this.
Something else exciting.
Before we do that, even better, I am going to hand the floor to Sarah Meir from Retrofit Balsall Heath. Many apologies, Sarah. We moved you in the schedule, and I was looking at my old one. So Sarah is going to give us a kind of a response from on the ground to what she's heard so far. Sarah.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah from Retrofit Balsall Heath. If you don't know about us, very briefly, we're a Birmingham-based group and we're leading the way in retrofit. We're driving community-powered change, led by residents, not by developers, making our homes warmer, greener and fairer from the ground up. Ed talked about how do we make sustainability more human? And in the report, one line really stood out to me. Adaptation must be brought down from the policy level and made tangible in people's lives. That sentence could have been written about Balsall Heath, because adaptation isn't policy, it's a practice for us. It's not something that happens in Westminster or at COP meetings. It's happening in people's living rooms, in lofts, on scaffolding, and in conversations neighbours are having together. Zach Polanski said recently that retrofit is actually one of the most positive, practical things that we can do. And he's right, retrofit is climate action that people can feel, because it's in your home, it's kind of staying cool in a heat wave, it's about being warm in winter, and really importantly, having a cheaper home to run. It means cleaner air, drier walls, and also the satisfaction of knowing that you're making your home future ready. At Retrofit Balsall Heath, we see retrofit as the front line of community adaptation. Every time we insulate a wall or seal a window or train somebody in retrofit skills, we're not just cutting emissions, we're building local resilience. We're protecting health, we're lowering bills and giving people visible proof that adaptation is actually possible. Because the truth is climate impacts are already here. As you know, we've discussed the floods and the heat waves and the energy shocks. They're not warnings anymore, they're actual headlines. But retrofit gives us a way to respond that's hopeful. It's a way of saying we can live through this and live well. The report calls for fairness and honesty in adaptation. We'd like to add one more word: ownership. People need to feel that climate action belongs to them, that it's not being done to them, but by them. And retrofit, we believe, does that. It gives agency back to communities. And in our little area of Birmingham and Balsall Heath, we've seen how contagious that can be. One retrofit sparks another. One neighbour's success becomes another person's inspiration. That's how resilience spreads, not through kind of being scared about it, but through example. Adaptation shouldn't sound like loss. It should sound like hope that's made practical. So what we say here, a community needs to be powered by purpose, like the future being built kind of one retrofit at a time. So yeah, so that's how we're doing it here. Retrofit is how we turn talk into actions, and we mitigate anxiety through it. So I hope I've told you a little bit about us in the 5 minutes that Rupert suggested I should talk about what we're doing.
Done an amazing job, and I hope you can see all of the hearts that are coming up in recognition for all of the work that you're doing, and in the chat again there is so much love for the work that you're doing. So thanks so much. You've offered a really inspiring example of what we're talking about on the ground. So that's really, really brilliant. I haven't seen so many hearts actually. It's going a bit mad.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to add something about language. You know, that this is the thing, making things tangible and real. You know, we're working with a really working class community. It's so diverse. Yeah, so if you're talking practical terms about, you know, this is what's happening to you, what is life like for you, and how can we make it better? That's that's what it's all about. That's what's going to you know, help affect real change.
It really is. Lovely, bless you, thank you. Okay, right. I am now swiftly moving on to Rupert to introduce the second half of our webinar.
Yes, thanks, Caroline. Thanks so much, Sarah. So what we're going to do in the remaining 25 minutes is take you into the Safer campaign a little bit deeper than some of you may have had a chance to go into it before. It follows very logically from what we've been doing so far. What this is about showcasing and supporting initiatives like Retrofit Balsall Heath. What this is about more generally is about taking those kinds of lessons from the We Need to Talk About Adaptation report and trying to apply them to campaigning. So over to our Safer campaign manager, Ed Jarvis, to give us this quick deep dive into Safer.
Thanks so much, Rupert, and thank you, Sarah, for that summary of what you're doing in Retrofit Balsall Heath. I love the bit about you're on the front line, actually doing the doing. So we launched in July the Safer campaign, and since then we've been thinking really quite intensely about what our strategy should be and what our goals are. So this slide just takes you through the 3 layers of our goals. So the first one is all around public awareness and acceptance. So we want adaptation to be part of people's lives in the UK. We want adaptation to absolutely to be seen as a no regret thing, building a resilience, making communities safer, is an absolute no-brainer. It is also our help that it would act as something as an on-ramp to more climate engagement. As people realise, and we've talked about the Atlantic Ocean current systems, as people realise that, you know, breakdown of the Atlantic Ocean current system is a possibility, real risk. And at the same time, we're heading for a 2.7 degree world. We've got this massive range that we need to start adapting to. It's incredibly difficult to do that. Not impossible, but incredibly difficult, incredibly resource intensive. We've got to, hopefully people will start to think, oh, actually what we need to also do really rapidly is decarbonize and to regenerate nature. So there's that bit. So that's the first layer. And then there's the community resilience initiatives like Retrofit Borsal Heath. There's all sorts of initiatives already happening out there. We'd like to support existing initiatives, and we'd very much like to trigger some new initiatives. And, you know, we'll talk about how we're looking to do that a bit later. There's a political action component to this as well that we're splitting out into two. So government needs to adopt adaptation as a central pillar of its policy to protect everything else it's doing. If you're not thinking about adaptation, you're not risk managing all the other outcomes that you want to have in the UK. And we want to help and pressure the government into accelerating a national resilience agenda in the UK. So there's that aspect. And there's also a bit about, we want political parties and the political discussions are focused much more on adaptation. And we want to see that coming through much more in the media narrative as well, building on all the stuff that we've heard from the report. We you know, there's still a gap. We want to see more. So coming back to the report, so if you go to it, and I know we're sharing links in the chat, perhaps we could share another link to the chat on the SAFER website now. If you go to the bottom of the report, obviously read the whole thing, but if you go to the bottom, there's some really fabulous recommendations in there. So I'm just going to quickly put the recommendations up on the left-hand side of the screen here. So there's recommendations for the environmental organisations. I'm not going to read out all the bullets. I'll leave you to do that and read the report in your own time. There's recommendations for the public. There's recommendations for policymakers and business, and there's a number of thematic recommendations. So that's what the report's saying. Well, how does that actually map across to what the SAFER campaign's doing? Well, it maps incredibly closely. And I'm just putting a quick summary on the right-hand side of the slide above. So let's just look at public awareness and acceptance. Well, clearly that maps back to what the report's asking for, recommending for the public around demanding local action in local authorities and co-creating local action with local communities. It also absolutely maps across to seeding and supporting existing community resilience initiatives. And absolutely, there's a direct line between for policymakers and the political action, getting government adoption and wider cross-party political acceptance. There's probably a couple of exceptions, a little bit. So we're not directly in the space of supporting campaigns on accountability, that's not what we're doing. We're incredibly supportive of that happening, of course, but it's not something that's coming out of the campaign currently. And just to highlight, bottom left in the thematic side, the educational outreach. So there's a sister campaign, the Climate Courage campaign that Les and Josephine are running with. That Climate Courage campaign is very much focused on the educational outreach. So we've got a huge amount of consistency and read across between the report and what we're doing on the SAFER campaign. Now, we've talked about place, and coming back to what Sarah said about place being really, really important, and a number of other people have said, place is fundamental. So let's just think about what our place strategy is from a campaign perspective. So adaptation needs to happen on the ground in communities. So we live in a nation of nations. So we've got devolved nations in the UK. So we absolutely need to be aware of what those devolved nations are saying and what their policies are, even feed into their policies, and have an awareness of that so that we can align around them and increase the impact of them and increase the multiplier effect of what's already happening. And in fact, in some of those devolved nations are ahead of certain other ones. So let's, showcase what some of those nations are actually doing. So that's really important. there's a real opportunity for volunteers here as well. So what we're looking to do is expand what we're asking and what we're offering around volunteers by having a two-layer approach to volunteers. So having a regional approach, which maps directly back to the point above, right? Having some representatives from Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, that really know, even a lower level, London, the Southwest, so that we've got that level of, we're plugging into the people that really know what's going on at that level. And then as a second layer, have safer champions. So the safer champions are place-based people that are really looking to seed new adaptation initiatives, advocate for adaptation, to talk about it, to signpost it, potentially advise on it, to really, trigger stuff happening at the grassroots level. Now, we don't have, the capacity to run and to create and run a mass grassroots network, but there is something we can do in this space that I think would have massive returns on it in terms of promoting adaptation. But the focus is really on, can we, from a light touch perspective, enable and facilitate peer-to-peer connections and sharing of learning and so on and so forth at the place level. And then the last one, which is very exciting because it is incredibly live at the moment. So Karen Jack and Chantel Burns are doing a fabulous job at talking to community leaders in Ely. We've got our first pilot of the Safer Workshop, which is a deeper dive, 2+ hour experience, all aimed at happening in a specific location to trigger more adaptation happening in that space, either supporting existing ones or seeding new. And so we've got a pilot in Ely on November the 27th. Which is very exciting indeed. And that's a workshop that we're looking to roll out across the country when we've got funding for it, to trigger that kind of groundswell of activity from the bottom up in communities, building on what's already happening. A quick update on the team. So who are we? So you can see on screen, so you've heard from Rupert today, you're hearing from me now. Jenny Savage, we are the core team. Anya's just joined as well. So you heard from Anya if you're here just before 8:30. Anya's doing a fabulous job on social media. We now have a TikTok channel. Perhaps a moment to share the TikTok channel again. There's some really interesting content on there. I just mentioned Karen and Chantel working on that Safer Workshop, that deeper dive that we want to roll out across the country. Caroline, thank you for everything you're doing in terms of advising. Nick has done a fabulous job, but is moving from campaign manager into the advisor role. And this is honestly just as a result of lack of funding. So funding is, as it is in lots of organisations like ours, a significant factor. It's a key priority to us to keep funding to keep the campaign going in 2026. So I think we're going to drop the donation link into the chat as well during this session. But also, so any donations are very, very welcome. But also, if people know of foundations that we could apply to, don't hold back, do send them through. We're obviously scanning as well, so do pop that through. I'll put my email will come up in a moment, or you can message me here. Now, the bit that gets me really excited is what can we do about all this, and what are we doing, and what can you do? So let's get into the action side of things. So connect today in the chat. So the chat has been amazing. If you hadn't had a chance to share your LinkedIn organisation profile, get your question in, whatever it is, add your telephone number to join the WhatsApp, the Safer WhatsApp group. Please take a moment to do that now. Read and share and comment on the report. Let's get this out onto social media. Let's create a buzz about it and get it. Let's have that conversation happening in the UK. There is a petition. So we started a petition about three or 4 months ago now, and the petition is all about demanding that the government create a funded national strategic adaptation plan. So we want 10,000 signatures for that by the end of the year. We're at 4,400, which is great. It's really difficult for these things to get up to 10,000. Most of the parliamentary petitions don't reach it. So please take a moment when the QR code comes up in a moment to sign and share. Get it out onto your social media, please. Let's get to 10,000 before the end of December so that we have a discussion in Parliament. And we're also working with Caroline on building parliamentary support for this through the all-party parliamentary groups with a view to having an early day motion in Parliament. Wouldn't that be amazing? Your adaptation initiatives, so please share if you're aware of really good examples or people who've got really interesting plans for them. Please drop links in the chat, please email us, let us know. We'd love to showcase adaptation initiatives on our website so that we can point to people at the art of the possible. Look what Retrofit Walsall Heath are doing, you know, look what flooded people are doing, look what all these other people are doing around the different themes of climate change, the climate impacts that are upon us. Now, there's so many actions. There's another slide. So let's go through. There's the volunteering. If you're interested in the volunteering, or if you're interested in, you know, representing Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales in some way, you know, we'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in being a safer champion, someone who talks locally about adaptation and advocates for it in your local community, we'd love to hear from you. And if you are interested, once we've got through the pilot, we've templated the whole safer workshop, and we're looking to roll it out next year. If you're interested in being involved in facilitating and actually doing that, you know, we'd love to build up a little pool of facilitators that are keen on doing that. So that's volunteering. The safer haven. So this is a fabulous idea from Nick, which is the idea of convening, connecting and growing the adaptation field. So there is a community resilience assembly, which is, you know, a bit of a starting point for this. So Anna Hyde is absolutely blasting ahead with this next week in London. I think it's Wednesday, Thursday. Nick and I are going to be there in London. It's all about resilience and community adaptation and sharing and connecting. So do come and talk to us. Forgive us if we don't recognise you. There's there's been 260 people in this webinar today, but do come over to us and say hello. It'll be lovely to connect. And then there's a number of reports. Jan mentioned some of them right at the start, that the climate popularism is probably one of the key ones from a safer perspective that Rupert and Caroline are putting together. And also just to re-mention the Working Class Dialogues Class and the Climate Movement event that's happening in London at 5 o'clock tomorrow, not far from Euston. So this is all about bridging the divide that there is with working class, lower income people, and looking to get them much more engaged, or seeing what we need to change in order to encourage engagement. You know, so how do we do that? What do we need to do differently if we're going to build a climate movement that is inclusive? So if you're really interested in that, do send Anya Bomber, who's in this meeting now, your email address, and we can get the Ticket Tailor event through you. So not a public event, it's by invitation only, but if that's something of interest to you, or you know people in that area who might be available, please do shout. And of course, if none of those activities appeal to you, or even if they do appeal to you, but potentially you're struggling with time, you've guessed it, what you can do is, again, just coming back to you can donate some money to the CMP so that we can carry on into 2026. We'd really appreciate it. And then my last slide is the QR code for the petition. So please get your cameras out. We'll drop the link into the petition into the chat now. Let's have a really big push, and we will be putting it out on our socials again over the next week and a half to really get rocketing up to the 10,000 mark. So please sign, share, comment, and all the rest of it. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, Ed. Thank you. Yes, so that petition is really important, and I know quite a lot of you in the chat have been saying, you know, what's the most important thing to be doing, and there is 100 important things to be doing. But if we can really urge you to sign that petition, because as Ed said, if we get 10,000, then we are on the way to getting a response from government, and then of course if we get the 100,000, then we get the debate hopefully in Parliament too. But that issue about, you know, the kind of paradox in a sense to what we're talking about is local action and local resilience, but we need government to give power and resources to the local level to really enable that to thrive, is kind of what the petition is about. It's asking the government to come up with this adaptation plan, which will involve a significant devolution of money and power to a more local level. And that's really what I think is needed if we're really to really scale this up. So we have just less than 10 minutes for some questions, and I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat, although it has been just amazing. Thank you so much for just such a flourishing chat, and we will absolutely capture all of this. I know a lot of you have put your contact details there, and we will follow up after the webinar is over. But in the meantime, I just wanted to come to a couple of questions, and one of them feels really important to me, from someone called Karen, who is saying, how will people who don't have enough money to get by on right now actually be able to respond to the idea of retrofit? That might just seem like a distant dream to them when they're just kind of worrying about how to get food on the table. So her question is this really just for the better off? And I would love someone to really address that, because if that were the case, then we would definitely be in the wrong space, and that must not be the case, as I'm sure we all agree. But Rupert, Ed, does anyone want to take that question about how we make sure this is something that everyone can be engaged in?
Yeah, happy to make a start. So I couldn't agree with you more, Caroline, and with the questioner. And I think this comes back to why what this has to be is a combination of bottom up and top down, right? What we know is that at the moment, for example, in this country, the government is funding adaptation far too little. There's far too little resource for resilience, and that's the basis of our petition and what we're calling for, right? So we need to jumpstart that by doing stuff and by calling for stuff locally where we are. But we also know that more marginalized communities, for example, working class communities, the kinds of communities that often do get devastated, for example, by floods, right? That those communities are not going to be able to do all of this by themselves, at least not to nearly a sufficient extent. So that's why it has to be both. And it just can't be a matter of saying government has to do it all, because they're just not going to. And it can't be a matter of just saying, well, this just throws it back onto everyone's own individual resources, because in some cases those are not going to be enough. So that's really the basis for the strategy of our campaign, which Ed tried to outline earlier. Ed, do you want to add anything further on that?
I think we need national funding in order to facilitate this local action, which is exactly what that petition is pushing for. So no, I think that's nailed it.
Yeah, that's just another reason to get out there, please, and sign it and share it in the networks that you have, because we really do need to scale it up. There was a question from Marina, who was saying that a real understanding of trauma is often missing from these conversations. Where do trauma-informed principles and practices feature in the work examined to date? And I would love us to answer that question, because the CMP, the Climate Majority Project, has been doing a huge amount of work on thinking about the trauma that is involved in the whole debate that we're having here just now. And one whole strand of the CMP's work is called the Climate Courage Campaign, and that's all about education and how we make sure that teachers are equipped with the time and the resource and the training to be able to properly teach around climate and nature in a way that gives space to and support for a very legitimate and understandable response from young people, which of course is to be really concerned and having quite a lot of anxiety about the kind of future that we're talking about. I don't know, Rupert, if you wanted to add any more on that, or on the 𝐓𝐷RA work. I think Les might be on the call too. Les is one of our wonderful managers of the Climate Courage campaign, so he may want to add a few.
Yeah, let's invite someone more involved with Climate Courage to speak in a second, maybe Les. But you've already made a great start there, Caroline, which of course is quite right, because this is an area of your increasing interest and expertise, including with us. My own view is that absolutely this is crucial. There is enormous trauma, a great deal of it is unacknowledged, and it's only going to grow, I'm afraid, for a long time to come. And this speaks partly to the Climate Majority Project theory of change, right? Which highlights the absolute importance of processing the difficult truth together, of doing shared inner work. And we think this is a theme which has been neglected often in climate activism and certainly climate politics to date. And we are very interested in correcting that omission, really. Les, anything you'd like to add specifically about Climate Courage, which is the sort of sister campaign to Safer, trying to bring inner adaptation into the picture more powerfully than it has been so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rupert. Thanks, Caroline. I mean, you've explained what the Climate Courage campaign is, but maybe just to paint a picture. Imagine that you're a teacher standing in front of a class of 30 young people who've all got different responses to the climate and nature crisis, and you know, some of them are apathetic, some of them are scared and distressed, some of them, you know, have been told by their parents, their grown-ups, you know, that this is all nonsense. If you're a teacher and you're standing at the front of that classroom and you're not properly equipped to talk about that with those young people, and to create the space where trauma and distress can you know, be handled and listened to and work with, and still find ways to move forward collectively as a class, as a whole school, as a community. So the Climate Courage campaign is really focusing on how we support our teachers, our climate educators, the mental health professionals who are seeing this, you know, this broad sense of increasing overwhelm for our children and young people. I've put some links in the chat to the campaign page, and yeah, if anybody is interested to find out more, I'll put my contact details in, and we can follow up outside of this discussion.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Les. We are beginning to run out of time. We've got 4 minutes. Yes, Rupert, would you say something about 𝐴𝐶RA?
I can certainly do that. Yeah, so this is something which some of you may not be aware of yet. It's a big new lottery-funded project put together by the Climate Majority Project and the Climate Psychology Alliance and the Mindfulness Initiative. And again, really, it's an attempt to really build the profile of inner adaptation, of shared inner work, as an absolutely crucial part of climate response. So 𝐴𝐶RA stands for Inner Climate Response Alliance. I've just put a link to it in the chat a moment ago, and it sort of expands the idea of climate courage and connects up with the safer idea to seek to elicit support for those who are doing this trauma work around the country, including people who don't really intend to. For example, one of the motivations for 𝐴𝐶RA is that we found that people who are doing climate literacy work were finding that questions of emotional difficult response to the climate ecological situation were coming up spontaneously, and the people doing the climate literacy work were struggling emotionally with that. So they need support, and we're trying to build in 𝐴𝐶RA a community of practice to enable that to happen.
Lovely, thank you so much. And just in our last few moments, there were a couple of questions that were really asking some practical things. So what can we learn from the EU? Are there projects there on adaptation we could learn from? Tina Rothery, so much is going on. What's the one thing that could perhaps thread all this together to give some sense of movement? I would say obviously the petition, but we need more than that as well. There was a question from someone called Fiona about what practically can community groups do to champion and support retrofit. So maybe I'm going to give the floor back to Kate, if she is still with us, to answer any of those that might interest her, and then have a final word from Rupert. Kate, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still there. I would just say a point about when we think about talking more about adaptation, let's remember to also talk to our funders about adaptation. We talked about the importance of bottom-up community work and top-down work because we live in a democracy, so let's enjoy that and participate in it. But our funders are also really crucial to this. A lot of them are already working on climate mitigation and just starting to get interested in adaptation. So retrofit I see as a great example of something that contributes to both mitigation and adaptation. So let's encourage them and invite them into this conversation so we can make it inclusive for everybody. I'm not sure who to pass to next.
Well, given we've only got a minute, I think probably Rupert. Thank you, Kate.
Well, yeah, it's time for us to wrap up, isn't it, really, Caroline? I'm going to say thank you so much to everyone for joining the call this morning, by far our biggest ever webinar. Do save the chat with those famous 3 dots on the right-hand side if you want to do so. Thank you so much to Caroline for chairing and for writing the foreword to our We Need to Talk About Adaptation report. Do go away and download and read the report, do share it, etc. As Kate was saying, we want this to influence the space and to influence it in a really synergistic way, including things like the philanthropic dimension of the space. Caroline, back to you for a final word, and then we'll wrap up because it's 9:45.
Well, we did promise people we would end dead on 9:45, so I'm determined that we will. But I just want to thank all of our amazing speakers so much. I think it's been such an inspirational session this morning. And I think what's been really inspirational is just seeing the amount of engagement and the amount of work and the amount of just, you know, real commitment from people in the chat. So thanks so much to everybody for being here this morning. And if I can just urge one last thing, please make sure you sign that petition and please share it among your networks, because it's a really practical thing you can do. And we look forward to continuing to engage with you in the future as well. So we've got all of your details. And so this network is just going to keep getting bigger. So thank you very, very much, all of you, for being here. Thanks.